June 22, 1941, the night Germany shattered its pact with the Soviet Union. 3 million Axis soldiers crashed across the border like a steel avalanche. Joseph Stalin's military command faced a horrifying reality. They were losing everything. Within months, the Luftwaffe controlled Soviet skies with such dominance that daylight flights became suicide missions. But what the German high command didn't anticipate was that their nightmare would arrive not in the light of day, but in the suffocating darkness of night. Piloted by women they would come to call Nacht the night witches. These Fabricant plywood relics from the 1920s were never designed for combat. They had open cockpits, no radios, no parachutes, no armor, and no guns mounted on the aircraft itself. Their maximum speed of 94 miles per hour meant that German Messerschmitt fighters cruising at 350 miles per hour literally couldn't fly slow enough to shoot them down without stalling. But this primitive simplicity became their greatest weapon. The Po-2 could carry 6 bombs beneath its wings and operate from crude airstrips that more sophisticated aircraft couldn't use. More importantly, its wooden frame and fabric covering produced almost no radar signature. By May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, composed entirely of women from pilots to navigators to mechanics, received their combat orders. Commander Yevdokия Bershanskaya, a stern woman of 30 years with ice in her veins and steel in her spine, led 280 women toward the front lines. Their mission seemed simple on paper: harass German positions at night, disrupt sleep, destroy supplies. The reality proved infinitely more dangerous. According to records preserved in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow, the Night Witches developed a tactic that would become legendary. They flew in formations of 3. 2 planes would draw searchlight, fire, and anti-aircraft attention, while the third, engine idling to near silence, glided toward the target. The Germans below would hear only a soft whooshing sound like a witch's broomstick cutting through air before bombs exploded around them. Then the planes would rotate, rolls, and attack again and again. Some nights, a single Po-2 crew flew 15 to 18 missions, returning to base only long enough to reload bombs and refuel. The psychological impact proved devastating. German soldiers, already stretched thin on the Eastern Front, found themselves unable to sleep, constantly listening for that terrible whisper in the darkness above. August 9th, 1942, Senior Lieutenant Nadia Popova and her navigator Katya Ryabova approached their target near the Caucasus Mountains. Their Po-2 biplane barely visible against the starless sky. Below them, a German ammunition depot sat behind layers of anti-aircraft batteries that had already claimed 3 Soviet aircraft that week. Nadia cut the engine to idle, and the sudden silence felt like death itself. They glided downward through streams of tracer fire that painted the darkness in deadly colors, the wind screaming through the wing struts, the only sound betraying their presence. The Germans called them Nacht, but the name carried more than mockery, it carried genuine fear. Wehrmacht soldiers wrote letters home describing sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and the supernatural dread that came with that distinctive sound. One captured German diary entry, referenced in historian Inagel's comprehensive work A Dance with Death. Soviet airwomen in World War II described the Night Witches as precise, vengeful, and impossible to predict. The soldier wrote that his entire unit had developed a nervous condition from weeks of nightly attacks, with men flinching at every sound after dark. The Soviet command initially underestimated what these women could accomplish, assigning them outdated equipment and expecting modest results. But the 588th Night Bomber Regiment exceeded every projection. They flew over 23,000 combat missions, more than any comparable male unit. Each mission required extraordinary skill because the Po-2 aircraft demanded constant attention. The open cockpit meant pilots faced temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. Frostbite became so common that ground crew kept heated rooms ready for returning pilots to thaw their frozen hands and feet. The fabric wings iced over, adding dangerous weight. Instruments froze solid. Nadia Popova herself flew more than 850 combat missions during the war, becoming one of the most decorated Soviet pilots of any gender. She once returned to base with 42 bullet holes in her aircraft. The fabric wings shredded, fuel leaking, her navigator wounded but still calling out directions. The ground crew counted the holes in silent amazement. Any one of them could have killed both women instantly. The German military command tried everything to stop the Night Witches. They offered Iron Cross medals to any pilot who shot one down, a distinction usually reserved for destroying far more valuable heavy bombers. They positioned additional searchlight batteries around high-value targets, specifically to catch the slow-moving biplanes. They stationed their best anti-aircraft crews at positions the Night Witches regularly attacked. Yet the attacks continued, night after night, eroding German morale while boosting Soviet spirits. Life expectancy for Night Witch crews measured in weeks, not months. 23 of the regiment's pilots died in combat, a casualty rate that would have broken lesser units. But for every woman lost, determination hardened among the survivors. They painted their lips with ammunition casing grease before missions, a small act of femininity and defiance. They decorated their planes with flowers and personal insignia, despite regulations against it. They sang songs between missions, dark humor masking genuine terror about whether they'd see another sunrise. The spring offensive of 1943 brought the Night Witches to Taman Peninsula, where German forces fought desperately to maintain their bridgehead. The regiment flew multiple missions every night for months. Their aircraft so shot up that mechanics worked around the clock, performing miracles with fabric patches and salvaged parts. February 14th. 1943, the night carried a bitter irony that Yevgenia Rudnava couldn't ignore as she climbed into her navigator's seat. While people in peaceful times celebrated love on this date, she prepared for her 219th combat mission over Rostov-on-Don, where German forces had transformed the city into a fortress. The young astronomer from Moscow State University had traded her telescope for bomb site calculations, her steady voice guiding pilot Panna Prokofieva through flak that turned the sky into a steel storm. The German Luftwaffe commanders had initially laughed at intelligence reports about Soviet women flying combat missions in obsolete biplanes. Luftwaffe ace Johann Steinhoff allegedly told his squadron that shooting down a Po-2 would be like swatting a mosquito with a sledgehammer, difficult because they're too slow and too small to be worth the trouble. But the laughter died when these mosquitoes destroyed hundreds of tons of ammunition, fuel dumps, and dozens of armored vehicles. The Night Witches struck Wehrmacht supply lines with such precision that entire German divisions found themselves without fuel or ammunition at critical moments. What made the Night Witches particularly effective wasn't just their courage or skill, it was their systematic approach to psychological warfare. Commander Bershanskaya understood something that many military strategists missed. Exhausted soldiers make fatal mistakes. Her regiment didn't just bomb targets. They orchestrated campaigns of sustained harassment designed to prevent sleep. 3 plane formations would arrive in waves throughout the night, sometimes attacking the same position 8 or 10 times before dawn. German soldiers couldn't rest, couldn't relax, couldn't escape the knowledge that death whispered through the darkness above them. By mid-1943, German military intelligence had dedicated significant resources to countering the Night Witches. They studied attack patterns, predicted likely targets, and positioned night fighters along probable approach routes. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who would become one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 301 kills, reportedly spent 3 weeks attempting to intercept Night Witch formations near Crimea. Never succeeded in downing a single Po-2, later describing the experience as chasing ghosts. They appeared, struck, and vanished before we could engage. The Soviet press, meanwhile, turned the Night Witches into symbols of resistance. Pravda and Red Star newspapers published articles about their exploits, though often sanitizing the brutal reality these women faced. The propaganda served its purpose across occupied Soviet territory. Partisan groups and civilians took inspiration from stories of women striking back against the invaders. But the reality remained far grimmer than any newspaper account. Junior Lieutenant Larisa Rozanova's story exemplified both the triumph and tragedy of the regiment. On the night of July 27, 1943, her aircraft took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire over German positions near Novorossiysk. The plane erupted in flames, the fabric skin burning instantly. Protocol demanded immediate bailout, but Larissa had no parachute. None of the Po-2 crews did because the weight would reduce bomb capacity. Instead, she kept flying, the fire consuming the aircraft around her, and managed to crash land in Soviet-held territory. She survived with severe burns covering 60% of her body, but demanded to return to combat duty after 6 months of excruciating recovery. The German obsession with stopping the Night Witches revealed their effectiveness. Wehrmacht documents captured after the war showed that entire battalions requested transfers away from sectors where the 588th operated. German soldiers developed what military psychologists would now recognize as acute stress disorder, characterized by hypervigilance, insomnia, and panic responses to ordinary sounds. September 24th, 1943. Yevdokia Bershinskaya sat in her command tent reviewing casualty reports by candlelight, each name representing not just a number, but a woman she'd trained, laughed with, and sent into darkness knowing some wouldn't return. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment had just completed its 1,000th collective combat mission, a milestone that should have brought celebration. Instead, the commander stared at empty bunks and tried to compose letters to mothers who would never see their daughters again. The autumn months brought the Night Witches to the Kerch Peninsula, where German forces had established formidable defensive positions. Every mission into this territory meant flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a web of tracers and exploding shells. On October 1st, the regiment lost Polina Makon and Vera Belik when their aircraft disintegrated under direct flak hits. The next night, they lost Nina Olyanenko and Anya Vysotskaya. The night after that, 2 more crews vanished into the darkness and never returned. Yet the survivors never considered stopping. Senior Lieutenant Irina Sabrova flew over 1,000 missions during the warm, more than any other night, which pillowed accumulating flight hours that seemed physically impossible. She once flew 18 missions in a single night, landing only long enough for mechanics to reload bombs and add fuel. Her navigator Nadia Studalina calculated that they'd dropped over 200 tons of explosives on German positions, a staggering figure for such a small aircraft. The German military's frustration with the Night Witches led to increasingly desperate measures. In November 1943, the Luftwaffe stationed specialized night fighter squadrons equipped with primitive radar near Crimean positions specifically to intercept Po-2 formations. These Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighters carried powerful searchlights and upward-firing cannons designed for bomber interception. For several terrifying weeks, the Night Witches faced losses that threatened the regiment's survival, but adaptation kept them alive. The pilots learned to fly even lower, sometimes at treetop level where German radar couldn't track them. They varied attack patterns, changed approach routes constantly, and developed new tactics faster than German intelligence could counter them. Navigator Galina Galia Dakutovich invented a technique where crews would actually land in fields near German positions, wait until searchlights swept past, then take off again for a completely different attack angle. The audacity bordered on madness, but it worked. According to documentation from the Russian State Military Archive, the psychological impact on German forces intensified throughout late 1943 and into 1944. Wehrmacht letters intercepted by Soviet intelligence revealed soldiers' deteriorating mental states. One lieutenant wrote home describing how his entire company had been rendered combat ineffective, not through casualties, but through absolute exhaustion. Another soldier described hearing the sound of Po-2 engines in his nightmares during the rare moments he managed to sleep. Winter brought its own special hell. The Po-2 biplanes had no heating, no enclosed cockpits, no protection from the savage cold of Russian winter nights. Pilots wore every piece of clothing they could fit under their flight suits, but still returned with frostbitten faces and hands so frozen they couldn't release the control stick without help. Navigators suffered even worse. They had to operate maps, calculate bomb release points, and operate equipment with exposed hands and -4-degree wind chill. Rufina Gasheva and her navigator Natasha McLean became legendary for an incident on February 2nd, 1944, when German fighters intercepted them over Perekop Isthmus. A Messerschmitt pilot named Helmut Lipfort, who survived the war with 203 kills, later recorded the encounter in his memoirs. He described chasing the Po-2 for 15 minutes, repeatedly overshooting because his fighter simply flew too fast. Finally, frustrated beyond measure, he broke off the attack, radioing his wingman that trying to shoot down these witches is it's like a hawk trying to catch a butterfly. May 8th, 1945's Germany surrendered, and Europe erupted in celebration. The women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment gathered at their airfield near Berlin. Exhausted beyond measure but alive to witness victory they'd fought so desperately to achieve. They'd flown their final combat missions just days earlier, dropping leaflets instead of bombs, announcing Germany's impending surrender. The irony wasn't lost on them. Their last sorties were acts of information rather than destruction, though the terror their name invoked remained unchanged. The statistics of their accomplishments staggered military analysts on both sides. 23,000 combat sorties flown over for years of continuous operations. 3,000 tons of bombs dropped with devastating accuracy. 26 bridges destroyed. 9 trains derailed. 2 river crossings demolished. 700 armored vehicles and personnel carriers destroyed. 17 enemy positions obliterated. The 588th had accomplished what entire bomber divisions struggled to achieve. Using equipment that belonged in museums rather than war zones, 23 Night Witches died in combat. But their sacrifice earned recognition even the Soviet Union's notoriously stingy award system couldn't ignore. 23 women received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the nation's highest honor, including Nadia Popova, Irina Sabrova, and posthumously Yevgenia Rudneva, who died just weeks before war's end. Hundreds more received Orders of the Red Banner, Orders of the Red Star, and various campaign medals that couldn't adequately capture what they'd endured. Yet Stalin's Soviet Union remained deeply ambivalent about women warriors. The propaganda machine had celebrated them during desperate wartime, but peace brought a return to traditional gender expectations. The Night Witches were encouraged to return to normal women's roles, teaching, nursing, raising families. Their military records, while never hidden, weren't prominently featured in official Soviet war histories that preferred highlighting male heroes. International recognition came even slower. Western military historians largely ignored the Night Witches until the 1980s, when researchers like Nagel began documenting their stories before the surviving veterans passed away. Commander Yevdokia Bershinskaya, who led the regiment through every mission without losing her nerve or her compassion, never received the Hero of the Soviet Union award, despite recommendations from multiple superior officers. Some historians suggest this snub reflected institutional sexism. Others point to Stalin's paranoia about popular military figures. Regardless, Bershinskaya continued serving until 1946, then spent decades working as a civil aviation administrator, her wartime achievements largely forgotten by the public until late in life. The German soldiers who'd fought against the Night Witches carried their memories differently. In memoirs published decades later, Wehrmacht veterans spoke of the Night Witches with a mixture of respect and residual dread. Former infantryman Hans Jürgen, interviewed in 1992, described how the sound of those engines created a Pavlovian fear response that lasted years after the war ended. Even hearing a small prop plane in peacetime would make my heart race. The Po-2 biplanes themselves became museum pieces and monuments. Several surviving aircraft were preserved in Russian military museums, their fabric skin carefully maintained, bomb racks still attached. The crude sights and instruments exactly as the Night Witches had used them. Standing before these fragile machines, visitors struggled to comprehend that women flew them into heavy combat night after night, facing odds that would have broken most people after a single mission. Modern historians recognize the Night Witches as pioneers of psychological warfare and unconventional tactics. Their ability to achieve strategic impact through persistent harassment rather than overwhelming force influenced military doctrine regarding special operations and asymmetric warfare. The Israeli Air Force studied Night Witch tactics when developing their own night attack squadrons. American Special Operations Command analyzed how the 588th disrupted enemy operations far beyond their numerical strength. Why did Hitler fear the Night Witches? The answer lies not in the tonnage of bombs they dropped or the number of targets destroyed, though both were significant. Hitler feared them because they represented something his ideology could uncomprehend, and his military could undefeat ordinary women. Considered inferior by Nazi racial theory, systematically destroying German military effectiveness through courage, skill, and unbreakable determination. They proved that his superior Wehrmacht could be terrorized by adversaries he dismissed as weak. Every night they flew exposed the fundamental lie at the heart of Nazi ideology. The last surviving Night Witch, Nadezhda Popova, died in July 2013 at age 91. She'd spent her post-war years as a flight instructor, married her wartime mechanic, and rarely spoke publicly about her combat experience until the Soviet Union collapsed. In her final interviews, she described the Night Witch's legacy simply: We were just doing our duty. We didn't think about fear or death, we thought about protecting our country. If that made the Germans afraid to sleep, then perhaps they should have stayed home. The Night Witch's story transcends military history. It stands as testimony to human resilience, the power of unconventional thinking, and the extraordinary capabilities that emerge when people fight for survival against existential threats. Their legacy haunts German memories and inspires new generations. A reminder that courage isn't measured by physical strength or technological superiority, but by the willingness to face impossible odds with determination that refuses to break. The darkness that once carried their whispered approach now carries their legend. And in that darkness, the Night Witches fly eternal.